All right, so before we begin talking about importing our content from Photoshop to Unreal, I very quickly would like to go over this chart here, talk a little bit about sRGB and gamma correction. This is higher level stuff. I'll be honest, I don't quite understand it fully myself. I still find it decently confusing. The best way to think about it is what you see on your screen right now is a lie. The color values in this document are not correct. They are being calibrated for your monitor, but what's actually saved on the hard drive is a different color value than you see here. So you may be used to thinking that 128 is a mid-value, like a gray mid-value. So when you're making your textures, if I want a middle gray, it's 128. This is inaccurate for your albedo or diffuse. Simply not true. You can look closely here, and you can see we have this alternating pixel grid of black pixels and white pixels. It's a little hard on the eyes, but it shows you if you view at a distance, a middle gray is compared, would comparatively be 187. You can see it blends in with the pattern. 128 is way too dark. Okay, so how does this relate to Unreal? If I look at a material in here, you'll see there's an sRGB tab that's ticked. Essentially what this means is if I were to open, this material inside of Unreal right now, or inside of Photoshop right now, it would look exactly as it does in here. And that's because it's being gamma corrected. It has an sRGB gamma correction applied to it. Now, if we turn that off inside of Unreal, it drastically changes the color. You don't see it in here, but if I save this texture and apply the plastic, let's do the lighter one. If I turn this back on, you'll see some of the values in here, they get a little bit darker. You can see very easily, darker versus much lighter. We want the darker value. This is what it looks like in Photoshop. If I just, took the blue value off of here, you would only see that texture, and it would be this gray value. So you might be wondering, why are we even talking about this? Don't I always want my material to look like how it does in Photoshop? And the answer is, for the most part, true, except with your roughness. So your roughness, you actually want sRGB turned off. It will brighten up the texture somewhat, but your values are going to actually be accurate. And the reason why this is important, it's a little hard to explain without showing it, so I'm going to do that right now. Here we just have a plain white, actually middle gray material. It's using this simple middle gray. This is using 128, which is half of 255. So if we look at a chart here, 128 falls right in the middle. 255, 0 is black, 255 is white. So 128 falls in the middle on a linear scale. That is this blue line running here. We want this for a roughness, because if we need to invert the roughness inside of Unreal, for whatever reason inside of our material using a 1- node, we want to make sure that middle gray stays middle gray. Or if I'm inverting something that's, say, black and white, we want to make sure that those values are correctly inverted. So right now, this gray has gamma correction turned off. If I invert this texture inside of the material editor using the switch here, it doesn't change. It's the same gray value. It's that same middle gray. you can see it's brighter than it looks in Photoshop and in the texture because it is actually being gamma corrected inside of the engine. So even though the value is 128, the end result is gamma corrected for the monitor, so it looks like 186, like the true middle gray value. Now, if I go in and I disable this and make sure sRGB is turned on, it's giving me the darker value now. And at first you might not notice this. It seems like not that different, pretty similar. If I invert the value now, you'll see it's much darker. And that's because it's actually not middle gray anymore. It's being adjusted on the curve. It's actually being adjusted twice. So it's being adjusted on a curve before it enters the material editor. So when we're inverting from a slightly below dark value to a slightly above middle gray white value. So we're inverting from a lower to a darker value. So you could see if you have a roughness map that, as we discussed in the last video, it needs to be perfect to define your material. If you have something that's not calibrated properly, if it's not using linear space and it's using sRGB and it's getting gamma corrected, you're not getting the right roughness value in here. So whenever you import a roughness texture, please make sure that you always are turning off sRGB. This will save you a lot of trouble down the road. Excuse me. And just trying to understand the basics of this will save you a ton of hassle. You might not get the results you're expecting at first when you're turning off sRGB, but if something doesn't look right, it doesn't mean that Unreal is rendering it wrong. It just means you need to go back to Photoshop and you need to evaluate why it looks incorrect. So if we want to test this on a texture here, I'll export TGA version of this, and we can open it up. So, Explorer. Okay. So we have a roughness here, open in Photoshop. If I apply a levels adjustment with a value of 2.2, this is what our material looks like with sRGB turned off inside of Photoshop. You can see it's a lot brighter now. So to adjust for this, you'll maybe want to do a different levels or curves adjustment in Photoshop, apply that, turn off the top level, and now save this out. And this will be, this is how it will look inside of Unreal with sRGB turned off. So it will be darker in Photoshop. Just know that when you turn off sRGB, this is what you'll be getting. So using that levels adjustment, only changing the middle value here to 2.2 will give you the ungamma corrected version of this file. Just so you know, when you import a texture into Unreal, gamma correction is turned on by default unless you import a normal map. If it auto detects that it is a normal map, it will turn it off. The reason for this should be fairly obvious, that a normal map, it's mathematical values. It translates this into light and shadow information across your mesh. So if this was to get gamma corrected, your lighting and shadow values would be completely incorrect, because now it would be adjusted on this curve here as opposed to the linear value there. So now that you have a basic understanding of what sRGB is and why it's so important, I want to show you how I'm modularly creating these materials out of only 4 textures. You'll see there's 5 in here, but I'm really only using 4. So in the next video, we will go over sort of a best practices for creating content so that you don't have to make duplicates or essentially repeat work when it's unnecessary. So see you in the next video.